Well, many areas of the Corn Belt saw considerable rainfall over the weekend, and we have areas with more rain in the forecast here this week, it appears. Let's get the latest weather update. Joining us now, our good friend Eric Snodgrass with Nutrient Ag Solutions. And Eric, hope you had an awesome weekend, my friend. And as I said, there are a lot of areas over the weekend saw some pretty meaningful rainfall totals, didn't they?
Yeah, and it filled in some holes that had not been filled in for honestly a couple of months. I mean, where I live is one of those places. So, as we look back at the last 7 days, I mean, we had absolutely torrential rains in parts of the Dakotas, parts of Nebraska and Colorado. But then, if you look southern Iowa through Missouri into parts of the Mid South, we did have a couple places there last week that were added to this weekend that picked up over a foot of rainfall. So, there's major flooding with this. But take a close look at that map, follow the border between Missouri and Iowa and then go right across central and north central Illinois to northern Indiana. On Saturday, a very poorly forecast mesoscale convective system. What I mean by that is we didn't see it days in advance, rolled through that area, putting down in some places better than 3 inches of rainfall, some places over 6 inches of rainfall. And it hit one of the drier spots in Western Illinois. It hit a big quarter in the central part of Illinois. And this is, of course, an important part of our corn and soybean belt there that got a lot of heavy rain. Now, we did unfortunately see some severe weather with this over the weekend. We had hail in Colorado, hail that came into parts of the Central Plains, and then straight line wind damage in the southeast, and then tornadoes yesterday in Illinois. So there was that side of these storms as well. But when we take a look at just what happened over the last 7 days, there was a lot of rain in places that desperately needed it.
Yeah, a lot of rainfall, a lot of good, well-timed rain. And now, as we think about this week ahead, Eric, sounds like we see some more rain in the forecast for some areas of the Corn Belt as well.
Yeah, the latest update here, we're looking at the WPC. So when they make this map, they consider the European model, they consider all the models we run here at NOAA, they consider a lot of things. And so we're just using this map because I think it's the best way to identify who's got the best chances. You notice a lot of the Ohio River Valley, a lot of the Tennessee Valley, and of course, New England. What is important is there are better chances now in the upper Midwest. I mean, if you go up to parts of North Dakota, there is one part right along the border between that and Canada where we're having near record dryness for the last 45 or 35 days or so. So the Canadian prairie is still dry, which means they're going to love getting any chances of storms. Probably the worst spot in the U.S., and this is just my opinion, has been down into Texas. They have been just scorching hot, 100-degree heat every day, and no chances of rainfall in their forecast. Now, that could change early this week with some storms that will go across the panhandle. But other than that, I think South Central Texas stays brutally hot going forward.
Well, let's talk about temperatures. You mentioned Texas being brutally hot. How about the rest of the country? How are things going to look here as we go through this week?
Yeah, this is a 10-day forecast map of average temperature anomalies. And what's really driving this? Look up at Alaska first. That's where the heat is. And because of that, we're going to be seeing troughing happening in the central United States and central Canada. So there's a lot of cooler weather in place for the next. I mean, this gets you out there to the 17th of August. We don't see any risk of long duration heat in the midsection of North America. So the ridge gets squashed flat over parts of Texas. It moves into the southwest, and then heat builds late this week and early next week into the western United States. So if it's in those places, it's not in the Midwest. That's just not how the pattern sets up. So this is going to buy us a lot of time into August where the rains that just came in get to stay in the ground, don't get evaporated very quickly. And that was some critical rain for grain fill and for what the soybeans need to be doing here in this critical month of August.
Now, I just need to ask real quick as well with how hot it is in Alaska, Eric. I know we've been seeing some pretty substantial flooding, very interesting weather anomaly really kind of happening up there here over the last week or so, haven't we?
Yeah, there was major flooding in and around Juneau. One of the rivers really swelled up, and you probably saw a video over the weekend of a house getting kind of sucked into that river. But there's been major flooding, not just there, but we had big flooding in China a week ago from a typhoon. We had flooding, of course, like I showed you, coming out of parts of Missouri, but there was also flooding in southern Illinois. There's flooding in the southeast. I mean, these storms have been able to really deliver a tremendous amount of moisture in a shorter period of time. So, yeah, that flooding threat has been high in locales all over the world.
Well, let's talk a little more longer term,
Sure.
longer range, and thinking about this next map, we'll look at ocean temperatures and the coral reef temps. And I know this is playing a big part in a lot of those weather anomalies that are happening around the world right now, Eric.
Yeah, I just went through a forecast this morning where we talked about the new record high temperatures in July. So, July 2023 is the warmest July we've observed in kind of our modern era of observations, which go back about 100, about 170 years now. And I point this out because we have an El Nino developing. That's the warmth coming off of South America into the equatorial Pacific. We have the very hot temperatures that are off of the Canadian Maritimes there. I'm talking about in the North Atlantic. We did watch over the last 7 to 10 days very warm water come into the Gulf of Alaska. So if you look right off the coast of California, Oregon, Washington, you see the warm water. And then notice what's coming off of Japan out into the central North Pacific. You see there's a coupling between the atmosphere and the ocean. And what happens here is that normally when we see these kind of real quick heat waves hitting the ocean temperatures, it's usually due to very weak winds. And therefore we get stagnant water and the sun beats down. That's one way by which this can happen. I point that out because this is what helped drive those record high temperatures in the month of July and now in the beginning of August globally. But that El Nino developing there, it seems as though this is going to start to take over as the most dominant teleconnection going into fall and winter, because up until this point, it has not been. And that was a major kind of failure point on my part. I thought by July we'd see it engage. It really waited a long time in July and now here into August before it's really getting to go. And before we talk about that, sorry, man, I got a lot to cover today. That warm water that's coming off of Japan, watch that carefully, because should any tropical system called typhoons over there get over that warm water, they could move north into the Bering Sea, which is between Alaska and Russia, and eventually affect our pattern across North America. So you got to watch the whole planet as we move our way toward our fall time period.
No, great thoughts, and we appreciate the insight there. And thinking longer term here as we look at the U.S. specifically, walk us through what you're seeing on this map here, Eric.
Well, if you told me to draw you what October, November, December look like, that's fall, of course. If you said, draw me a fall pattern when there's a strong El Nino, I would have drawn you this. The browns represent where there's drier risks in the Pacific Northwest, the greens where there's wetter risks. So we've kind of had this thought process all along that if El Nino fully takes over, that we have to watch out for wet harvest conditions, not only in the Cotton Belt and up the East Coast, but in the Midwest as well. So I just have to mention that that's the case going forward. And remember, October, that's really the second half of the hurricane season. We still have a lot of tropical systems we'll have to be on the lookout for or be concerned about going into that time frame. So it appears right now that we could be looking at a risk on the wetter side during our harvest time period.
How are the tropics looking right now? I should ask, as we're starting to think about, hurricanes and tropical storms and more. Any activity so far, really, Eric?
Well, no, this week is looking pretty benign, the next 7 days, but I want to remind everybody that we still have better than 90% of the hurricane season still to come. So don't, that's where we are. We have a big, absolutely beautiful tropical system going south of Hawaii. It's called Dora. Dora is a Cat 4. It's going to miss Hawaii, but it looks like a buzzsaw on satellite. And this is what's crazy. It's probably going to cross the international date line, which is quite rare. We typically don't see that happening from tropical systems that come off of the west coast of Mexico. We have Eugene in the Pacific as well. Eugene, I think, is done. I'm not worried about Eugene at all, though. But yeah, this next 7 days, not a whole lot happening in the Atlantic, even though it is spring-loaded and ready to go.
Well, thinking about what happens in the Atlantic, sometimes some of that activity can touch South America a little bit as well, and then work its way up into the Gulf, into the U.S. But let's talk about South American weather as a whole. I know watching dryness has been in Argentina, yet we've been seeing some rain in Brazil. Get us up to speed. What's the latest you're seeing with South America, and then what's the longer-term outlook as well?
Yeah, so I had a chance this last week to talk to a group of Brazilian farmers. These were actually yield contest winners that were on a trip across the U.S. And when I showed them this map last Friday, as soon as the interpreter told them what it was, because unfortunately I don't speak Portuguese, they all ripped out their phones and took a picture of this map. And the reason they did was because right now in the Atlantic, so if you could just on this map find up in the upper right-hand corner, that's Africa, go across the Atlantic, we have very weak trade winds. Because of that, there is some concern that when the monsoon starts to get going in October and November, that it's going to be weaker than normal across much of Brazil, which means, they have to wait on good rains to start to get a crop established. And if they don't have it, they will not risk planting to lose the crop or have to replant. So there's just some concern overall about that. But in southern Brazil, which by the way, if you look down there where that green and blue is, okay, that's better than about probably 40% of where the crop is grown. They're planting later there, but they are expecting wetter conditions. That extends in Argentina as well. And just remember, this is an area that we typically see a better relationship with El Nino, right? La Niñas tend to make Argentina dry. El Ninos tend to make them wet. So this is going to be an important factor that as soon as we start harvesting, we're going to turn our attentions, our markets are, especially to South American weather. And this is going to be the way we think the season is going to start for them.
Well, Eric, great thoughts as always. Before we let you go here today, any final thoughts? Anything else you're keeping an eye on?
It's kind of crazy, but there are so many spots around the world I can't stop looking at. There's big storms in Europe. The Australians, they're pretty happy overall down there. India's missing out on a big piece of its late monsoon right now. And even though China's forecast dry, remember some places last week, like around Beijing, saw 20 inches of rainfall and major flooding. So there's no rest for the weary, right? We're just going to dive into another week of forecasting. And I do still think the markets are really looking a lot at these weather patterns and trading them right now.
Definitely. I couldn't agree more. We'll keep our eyes on it. We'll stay close with you as we continue to watch the weather. And I know folks can find some of the latest details online, ag-wx.com. They can also sign up for your weekly weather newsletter. Eric Snodgrass with Nutrient Ag Solutions. Thanks so much for joining us here this week, and we'll talk to you next week.
Sounds good.